There was a moment, sometime around 1973 or 74, when American childhood reached a kind of perfect equilibrium, one that has never quite been replicated. Not because the country was doing well, it wasn't. Gas lines stretched around city blocks. The news carried a weight that made grown men go quiet at the dinner table. And somewhere in Washington, the walls were closing in on a presidency that would change the way Americans trusted their government forever. But out on the sidewalks, out in the woods behind the new subdivisions, out in those long shadowed hours between school dismissal and the first streetlight flickering on, something extraordinary was happening. A generation of children was growing up almost entirely unsupervised, and that absence was quietly making them into something the decades that followed would struggle to produce again. Here is the part that almost nobody talks about. The freedom that defined 1970s childhood in America was not a philosophy. It was not a parenting movement. It was an accident, born from economics, from exhaustion, from a particular kind of trust in the physical world that evaporated so gradually most people never noticed it leaving. Parents were not permissive because they believed in independence. They were permissive because they were tired, because the suburbs felt safe, and because nobody had yet invented the vocabulary of danger that would come to rewrite American childhood in every decade that followed. The suburbs themselves were barely a generation old when the 1970s began. The great post-war migration out of American cities had been underway since the late 1940s. Driven by cheap land, federal highway money, and a mortgage system designed to move working families into brand new homes on the edges of every major metro area. By the time those families had children old enough to wander, the suburbs had developed a geography that turned out to be almost perfectly engineered. Not for families, for children. Cul-de-sacs created natural gathering spaces. Undeveloped lots sat between finished streets like gaps between teeth, breathing wild space into otherwise identical rows of ranch houses and split levels. Nobody planned it that way. It just happened. And into that accidental wilderness, an entire generation of American children disappeared every morning and did not come back until dark. What they found out there is something most accounts miss entirely. Those undeveloped lots were not empty. They were layered. Old fence lines from farms absorbed into subdivision grids, foundations of structures nobody living could name, creek beds that had been running since before the Revolution, quietly flowing beneath neighborhoods named after the very landscapes they had erased. Meadowbrook, Willow Glen, Forest Hills. A kid on a bike in 1974 could leave a street of identical houses and be standing in something genuinely ancient within 3 minutes. That collision between the brand new and the very old was one of the defining textures of growing up in that decade. It did something to a child's sense of scale that is almost impossible to explain to someone who never felt it. But that was only the surface of what was happening beneath those ordinary-looking streets. The economy was grinding through American household budgets in ways that rarely make it into the nostalgia version of this story. Stagflation, rising prices against stagnant wages, was doing quiet damage across the country. Mothers who had stayed home through the 1950s and 60s were entering the workforce in numbers that would have seemed impossible a decade earlier. Not as a statement, as a necessity. By the middle of the decade, dual-income households were becoming the rule, and that shift meant something very specific for the children left behind each morning. After school, after the bus dropped them at the corner, there was often nobody home. The term latchkey kid entered American vocabulary in the 1970s with almost no alarm attached to it. A child who wore a house key on a string around their neck was simply a child whose parents worked. No task forces, no campaigns. The child came home, let themselves in, found something in the kitchen, and went back outside until dinner. What is remarkable is how little distress most of those children report feeling about it now. The solitude was real, but so was what it built inside them. Something that cannot be scheduled or assigned. Something that only comes from being genuinely, completely on your own. Then came the toys. And this is where the story gets complicated in a way nobody was talking about at the time. Every account of 1970s childhood mentions the Hot Wheels tracks and the big wheels and the Schwinn bikes. And those things mattered. But what they never mention is what was actually driving the toy industry beneath the surface. It had nothing to do with children's happiness. Television advertising aimed directly at kids had exploded in the late 1960s. By the early 1970s, the Saturday morning cartoon block had become the most valuable real estate in American broadcasting. Not because of the cartoons, because of what ran between them. A child watching those commercials did not see advertising. They saw reality. They saw the SSP racers skidding across a neighbor's driveway as if it were already theirs. They saw the Evel Knievel stunt bike launching off its ramp in slow motion and felt the wind on their face. The gap between the commercial and the toy on Christmas morning was not a gap they could measure. It felt like a promise being kept. The toy industry had figured out, for the first time in history, how to speak directly to children over the heads of their parents. And the parents, stretched thin by 2 jobs and the general noise of the decade, largely did not look up. Think about what that actually means. An entire generation of American children was being shaped by a system of desire they experienced as pure, spontaneous wanting. Nobody explained it to them. There was nothing to explain. You wanted the toy the way you wanted lunch when you were hungry. The wanting felt biological. That was the whole point. The food worked the same way, and the two systems were more connected than anyone realized at the time. The kitchen of a 1970s American household was a specific place, shaped by the same pressures reshaping everything else. Swanson TV dinners, Tang in a pitcher on the counter. The frozen food aisle expanding week by week like it had somewhere important to be. These were not just convenient, they were aspirational. Tang had been reformulated for NASA's space program, and that was not incidental. That was the entire pitch. Drinking it meant something. It meant you were modern, forward, part of a story bigger than your subdivision. The cereal aisle was the same machine running at a different speed. Fruit Loops, Cap'n Crunch, Count Chocula appearing on shelves in 1971 like a small, edible piece of Halloween that somehow lasted all year. A child pouring that cereal on a Saturday morning was not making a dietary choice. They were completing a ritual designed specifically for them. The cartoon on the screen, the mascot on the box, the sugar hitting the bloodstream. The whole sequence timed and tested and delivered with a precision that would not be publicly scrutinized for another decade. The children inside it felt only one thing. Saturday morning, pajamas on, television going, cereal getting soggy in the bowl. That was the best. That feeling was absolutely real. What produced it was something else entirely. And then something shifted. Not loudly, not all at once. It started with the economy bottoming out in ways that felt personal rather than political. Interest rates climbing into territory that made buying a house feel like a gamble. The Iran hostage crisis running on the evening news for 444 days like a wound that refused to close. A slow unease spread through American households. The world outside the front door felt less predictable than it had seemed. And then, into that already anxious atmosphere, came the cases that changed everything. Eton Patz, 6 years old, missing from a New York City street in May of 1979. His face would eventually appear on milk cartons across the country, a detail so specific, so ordinary, so domestic, that it landed somewhere deep. Not on the news, in the kitchen, at the breakfast table, right next to the cereal. The Atlanta child murders followed. Then Adam Walsh in 1981. Each case amplified what was already building, a named, publicized, impossible to ignore fear about the safety of children in public space. And the response came fast. Fingerprinting programs at schools, neighborhood watch signs going up on telephone poles, stranger danger becoming formal curriculum, taught to children who had spent their entire young lives talking to strangers without a second thought. Reflective picture a kid in 1975, 9 years old, gone from morning to dusk, known to nobody for 8 hours, completely fine. Now picture that same kid's younger sibling in 1983. Same neighborhood, same street. Suddenly the world has a different shape. The woods behind the subdivision are still there, but they feel different now. The parents feel different. Something invisible has been installed, and there is no switch to turn it off. The children who had spent the early years of that decade disappearing into those lots and creek beds would, within a few years, become parents themselves. And they couldn't give their children the same freedom. Not because they didn't want to, because the cultural permission for it had quietly, irrevocably expired. The playdates that replaced spontaneous neighborhood play were not a philosophy. They were a reflex, a collective flinch from a fear that once learned could not be unlearned. And what was lost in that transition is easier to feel than to name. It wasn't just safety or supervision. It was a particular quality of time that belonged entirely to children. Unscheduled, unmonitored, genuinely open, in a way that required a very specific combination of geography, economics, and cultural assumptions that no longer exist in the same alignment. A child today who disappeared into the woods for 8 hours would generate a police response within 2. The freedom was not just a feeling, it was a structural condition. And that structure is gone. There is something in the 1970s childhood that people who lived it carry in a place they cannot quite locate. Not pure nostalgia, not grief exactly. Something in between. The memory of a world that asked more of you than it protected you, that let you be lost and find yourself, that gave you the very specific dignity of coming home at dark, exhausted and filthy and completely fine, knowing that you had done that yourself. Nobody had arranged it. Nobody had supervised it. It was just yours. That world closed quietly, without ceremony, somewhere between 1979 and 1983. Most of the people who had lived inside it were too young at the time to feel the door shut behind them. They felt it later. Most of them feel it still. The creek is still out there somewhere, running beneath the neighborhood that swallowed it. The lot between the houses is a driveway now, and somewhere a kid who was 9 years old in 1974 still knows every step of that path through the woods, still knows which root to step over, which branch to duck under, which bend in the creek caught the afternoon light just right. That kid is in their 50s now, and that path is still the one they dream about. So here's the question worth sitting with. What is it you find yourself missing most about that time? Not the objects, not the shows, but the actual feeling of it. Do you think any part of that world could ever find its way back? Drop your answer in the comments, and if this is the kind of story that means something to you, there are more waiting.